The October storm had passed through Portland Harbor 3 hours before dawn, leaving the docks slick with seawater and the air tasting of iron. Reverend Thomas Waverly felt the cold penetrate his wool coat as he navigated the uneven planks toward the harbormaster's office, his bad knee protesting each step. 47 years of New England winters had taught him to recognize the particular quality of cold that followed tragedy at sea. It settled into your bones differently than ordinary autumn chill. The message had reached Holy Hope Orphanage just after midnight, carried by a boy too young to be out in such weather. A fishing crew had pulled something from the water. Someone living. A child. The harbormaster needed the orphanage to claim him before the county men arrived with their paperwork and questions. Waverly had seen enough drownings to know that survivors were rare, and those who came back from the Atlantic often carried injuries that prayer couldn't touch. He expected to find a broken thing, hypothermic and traumatized, perhaps already dying despite the rescue. The harbormaster's office squatted at the end of the main pier, built from the same gray stone as the older warehouses. Yellow lamplight bled through windows crusted with salt. Through the glass, Waverly could see shapes moving. The fishermen, probably, waiting to give their account so they could return to their boats and forget whatever they'd seen. When Waverly pushed open the door, the conversation inside died. 6 men stood in the small room, their faces carved by decades of wind and sun into expressions of permanent wariness. But what Waverly saw in their eyes wasn't the usual fatigue of men who'd worked through the night. It was something closer to superstitious dread. Captain Isaiah Morse separated himself from the group. Waverly had known Morse for 15 years, had blessed his daughter's wedding and buried his wife. The man's hands had never shaken before, not even when he'd lowered his wife's coffin into frozen ground. They shook now. The boy sat near the cast-iron stove, wrapped in a blanket that had been meant for cargo, not passengers. 10 years old, perhaps, maybe 12. His hair hung in dark ropes, stiff with dried salt. His skin had the gray-white color of fish belly, yet he wasn't shivering. He should have been convulsing with cold, teeth chattering, body desperately trying to generate warmth. Instead, he sat perfectly still. His eyes found Waverly's, and the Reverend felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, exactly. Recognition, maybe, though of what he couldn't say. The boy's eyes were dark, brown or black, difficult to tell in the lamplight. But they held a quality Waverly had only seen once before, in the face of a woman dying of consumption who'd claimed she could see through the veil between worlds. A depth that suggested the eyes were looking out from somewhere very far away. Morse's voice came out rough, like he'd been shouting, though the office was quiet enough to hear the tide working at the pier's foundation. He described finding the wreckage at first light, 3 miles offshore. No identifying marks on the debris, just shattered wood and tangled rigging. The boy had been clinging to a section of mast, conscious but unresponsive, staring at the sky like he was reading something written in the clouds. When they'd hauled him aboard, he hadn't cried, hadn't spoken, just allowed them to wrap him in whatever they could find and sat in the same position he sat in now, watching everything with those impossible eyes. The strange part, and Morse lowered his voice when he said this, glancing at the other fishermen for confirmation, was that every man on the boat had felt it at the same moment. A certainty, sharp as a hook in the gut, that they needed to investigate that particular piece of debris. 3 of them had sworn. Later they'd been looking right at it, seeing only broken wood, until something made them look again and see the small hands gripping the timber. Waverly knelt in front of the boy, close enough to smell the sea on him. He kept his voice gentle, asking the basic questions. Name, home, ship, parents, anything he could remember. The boy's lips moved, forming sounds that made Waverly's ear itch with almost recognition. Not English, certainly, not French or Portuguese, though Waverly's grasp of languages was limited to the Latin required for seminary. The words had rhythm, almost like singing, but the melody was wrong somehow. Ancient, maybe, or foreign in a way that went beyond simple geography. Costa, one of the Portuguese sailors, stepped forward. His English was broken but clear enough. He'd heard pieces of his own language in the boy's speech, Spanish too, and underneath, something that reminded him of the African tongues he'd encountered on merchant runs to Havana and Charleston. But it was all wrong, all mixed together in a way that shouldn't work, but somehow did. The boy reached into his blanket and produced a small canvas bag, dark with seawater but intact. Waverly opened it carefully, conscious of 6 sets of eyes watching him. Inside, a brass compass, European-made, expensive. A wooden carving, definitely African, depicting a figure with too many arms and a face that seemed to shift in the lamplight. A silver coin so tarnished Waverly couldn't read the date, and a length of braided cord, woven from what looked disturbingly like human hair. Black, brown, and gray strands, twisted together with such precision it must have taken hours. The objects told contradictory stories, European and African, valuable and worthless, recent and ancient. Waverly's rational mind wanted to construct a narrative that made sense. Perhaps a missionary's child, traveling from the Caribbean, carrying items collected from various cultures. But his instincts, honed by 17 years of ministry in a port city where strange things washed ashore regularly, whispered that the explanation wouldn't be so simple. By the time Waverly arranged transport to the orphanage, dawn was breaking over Portland, turning the harbor water the color of rust. The boy walked to the carriage without assistance, his movement steady despite hours in the Atlantic. The fisherman watched them go with visible relief, and as Waverly helped the child into the carriage, he saw Captain Morse cross himself, a gesture he'd never witnessed from the staunchly Protestant sailor. The ride inland took them through Portland's commercial district, past brick counting houses and white churches that proclaimed the city's prosperity. The boy watched everything with that same penetrating attention, his head turning to track certain buildings with what looked like recognition. Impossible, of course. Unless he'd been to Portland before. Unless he'd somehow survived another shipwreck, another disaster, and was only now returning. Holy Hope Orphanage rose 3 stories above the surrounding houses, built in 1845 with money from shipping families who wanted to demonstrate their Christian charity. 30 beds, currently housing 23 children whose parents had been claimed by tuberculosis, factory accidents, or simple poverty. Waverly ran the institution with 3 teachers, 2 cooks, and a rotating cast of church volunteers who helped with everything from laundry to Latin lessons. Dr. Elias Crawford arrived within the hour, summoned by a message Waverly had sent ahead. At 31, Crawford represented the new generation of physicians, Harvard-trained, skeptical of folk remedies, devoted to what he called the scientific method. He brought instruments Waverly didn't recognize and a leather journal in which he recorded observations with the precision of a botanist cataloging new species. Crawford's examination revealed findings he would later describe as medically impossible. The boy's vital signs were perfect. Pulse steady at 60 beats per minute. Breathing deep and regular. Body temperature normal, perhaps even slightly elevated. His skin showed no damage from prolonged water exposure. No maceration, no salt burns, no signs of the violent battering that shipwreck survivors inevitably exhibited. More troubling was the boy's general condition. He appeared well-fed, muscles firm, teeth intact and clean. His fingernails were whole, not torn or split from clinging to wreckage. His hair, once dried, proved to be recently cut. He looked like a child who'd been well cared for until yesterday, not someone who'd survived a maritime disaster. Crawford conducted neurological tests using techniques he'd learned in Boston. Reflexes sharp, coordination excellent, vision and hearing perfect. But when he tried to assess cognitive function using a set of colored wooden blocks, something happened that would fill 3 pages of his journal. Crawford had arranged the blocks on a table, intending to have the boy sort them by shape or color, a standard test of developmental level. The boy studied the blocks for perhaps 30 seconds, then began moving them with quick, precise gestures. The pattern that emerged wasn't random. It was Portland Harbor, rendered in miniature with disturbing accuracy. Each block represented a specific landmark: wharves, churches, the customs house. And one block, placed 3 inches offshore, marked the exact location where the fishing boat had found the wreckage. Crawford felt cold spread through his chest. The boy had been barely conscious when rescued, transported directly to the harbor master's office, then brought straight to the orphanage. He couldn't have observed the harbor's layout. He couldn't have known where the wreckage was found. Yet the model was perfect. By midday, news of the mysterious survivor had infected the orphanage like fever. Children clustered in doorways, whispering. The older ones invented elaborate stories. He was a prince. He was cursed. He'd been raised by mermaids. The younger ones just stared, sensing something that made them uneasy in ways they couldn't articulate. Waverly had placed the boy in a small private room on the 2nd floor, away from the dormitories. A temporary arrangement until they could determine his identity and find appropriate placement. Assuming appropriate placement existed for a child who knew things he shouldn't know. Sister Agnes Hartwell took charge of feeding him, approaching the task with the same brisk efficiency she brought to all her duties. At 68, she'd raised 7 children and buried 2. She'd volunteered at Holy Hope since its founding, had seen every variety of childhood trauma, and prided herself on being unshakable. She returned from the boys' room an hour later, her face the color of old paper. Waverly found her in the hallway, one hand pressed against the wall for support. When she spoke, her voice had lost its usual certainty. The boy had eaten properly, she said, used his utensils correctly, cleaned his plate, perfect manners. When she'd turned to leave, he'd spoken in clear English, though his accent was strange. Part British precision, part something she couldn't identify. He'd thanked her for the meal. Then he'd mentioned her daughter Mary, Sister Agnes's 7th child, dead of scarlet fever at age 4, 21 years ago. The boy had described Mary's last hours with such precision that Sister Agnes had felt transported back to that terrible day in 1831, the particular way the fever had climbed, the exact words Mary had spoken before the delirium took her, details that Agnes had shared with no one, not even her husband before he died. And then the boy had delivered a message. Mary wanted her mother to know she hadn't been afraid at the end. She'd seen something beautiful just before the fever took her. She was at peace. Waverly listened to Sister Agnes's account with growing unease. This woman had been his anchor for 7 years, the one person he could depend on to remain steady when everything else shifted. Now she stood before him crying, insisting that a strange child had given her the one piece of comfort she'd needed for 2 decades. That evening, making his rounds through the orphanage, Waverly noticed changes in the atmosphere he couldn't quite define. The building felt different. Quieter, but not in the usual way. The silence carried weight, like the pause between lightning and thunder. He stopped outside the boy's room. No sound from within, but he had the distinct impression of being watched through the door, of being assessed and found wanting. Waverly had intended to enter, to begin the work of understanding who this child was. But standing in the hallway, his hand on the door handle, he found himself unable to move forward. For the first time in his ministry, Reverend Thomas Waverly experienced genuine dread. Not the ordinary fear of failure or scandal, but something deeper. The sensation of standing at the edge of an abyss whose bottom couldn't be measured, knowing that one more step would take him into territory where his faith might not be sufficient guide. He withdrew his hand and continued his rounds, telling himself tomorrow would be soon enough. But lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, Waverly heard something that transformed his unease into something sharper. A child crying somewhere above him. Not unusual in an orphanage. Then the crying stopped, cut off mid-sob with surgical precision. Footsteps in the hallway. Small footsteps, moving with adult purpose. A door opening. Silence. Then the footsteps returning to the boys' room, measured and unhurried. Morning brought the explanation, though it raised more questions than it answered. The crying child had been Timothy Ross, 6 years old, orphaned 3 months ago when his parents died in a factory accident. Timothy's nightmares had plagued him every night since his arrival, violent dreams that left him screaming and the other children sleepless. But last night, according to the children who shared his dormitory, Timothy had stopped crying suddenly, sat up in bed, and begun speaking to someone they couldn't see, a conversation lasting several minutes. Then he'd laid back down and fallen into what they described as the deepest sleep they'd ever seen. When Timothy woke, he told everyone who would listen that a boy had visited him, had shown him something wonderful. His parents, waiting in a beautiful place, happy and whole. They'd told him to stop being sad, that they wanted him to live. Timothy's nightmares never returned. Dr. Crawford arrived that morning with his leather journal and a determination to document this case with scientific rigor. He'd purchased the journal specifically for this purpose, intending to create a comprehensive record of the boy's behavior, development, and eventual integration into normal society. As a man trained in empirical observation, Crawford believed that every phenomenon could be understood through careful study. The boy represented a puzzle, certainly, but puzzles could be solved with patience and methodical investigation. He had no way of knowing that his journal would eventually contain accounts that would force him to choose between his scientific training and evidence that suggested the existence of phenomena science could not explain. The boy sat waiting in the examination room, displaying the same patient stillness. When Crawford entered and began arranging his instruments, the child watched with an expression the physician would later describe as sympathetic, as if the boy understood the limitations of Crawford's tools and felt sorry they would prove inadequate. The October sun climbed higher over Portland, casting long shadows across the orphanage grounds. In the days ahead, Holy Hope would become the site of events that would test the faith of believers, the reason of scientists, and the courage of everyone who encountered the boy with ancient eyes. But that first morning, as Dr. Crawford measured the child's skull with calipers and Reverend Waverly completed the admission paperwork, they couldn't yet see what was coming. They knew only that they'd taken responsibility for a child who shouldn't have survived, who knew things he couldn't know, who seemed to carry something inside himself that defied understanding. When Crawford finally asked what name he wished to be called, the child spoke clearly for the first time since his arrival. Samuel. No family name. Just Samuel. Spoken with finality that suggested this wasn't the name he'd been born with, but the name he'd chosen to wear during his time at Holy Hope. Crawford wrote it in his journal. Samuel. Unknown surname. Approximate age 10 to 12 years. Survived shipwreck through unknown means. Exhibits knowledge of events and locations he could not possibly have witnessed. Demonstrates abilities that defy medical explanation. As he wrote, Crawford couldn't know that within 2 weeks, everyone in the orphanage would understand that Samuel was not simply a traumatized survivor suffering from shock and memory loss. He was something else, something that had arrived in Portland with purpose. And that purpose was about to manifest in ways that would fracture the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, between the explainable and the impossible. The boy, Samuel, sat patiently through the examination, cooperative and calm. And when it was over, when Crawford had filled 6 pages with measurements and observations that raised more questions than they answered, Samuel looked directly at the doctor and smiled. It was not a child's smile. It was the smile of something very old, wearing a child's face, preparing to teach lessons that no one had asked to learn. Dr. Elias Crawford's journal had become something he no longer recognized. The neat columns and measured observations that characterized his other records had given way to entries written at odd hours, in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic. By the end of Samuel's first week at Holy Hope, Crawford had filled 40 pages with observations that his medical training couldn't adequately explain. Samuel adapted to the orphanage routine with disturbing ease. He attended prayers, sat through lessons, took meals at assigned times. On the surface, he appeared to be exactly what Reverend Waverly had hoped for. A quiet child adjusting to new circumstances. But the incidents accumulated like water behind a dam. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard discovered the first one on Samuel's third day. She'd assigned him to kitchen duty, peeling potatoes alongside 2 other boys. After 15 minutes, she noticed he'd stopped working. He stood motionless, staring at the pantry door. The flour barrel. Second shelf. Mrs. Pritchard had checked that barrel herself 2 days earlier. But something in Samuel's expression, the same quality she'd seen in her grandmother's eyes back in County Cork, made her investigate. The top layer of flour appeared normal. Digging deeper, she found what Samuel had somehow detected: moisture seeping through a crack in the barrel's side. Another day, and the entire supply would have been ruined, possibly contaminated. When she asked how he'd known, Samuel simply returned to peeling potatoes. The incident that shattered Crawford's carefully maintained skepticism involved Rebecca Ashford. The pregnant 14-year-old had been at Holy Hope for 2 months, sent by her uncle after her parents died of consumption. She spoke to no one, ate barely enough to survive, and spent most of her time staring at walls with dead eyes. Crawford had examined her twice, finding both mother and child physically healthy while worrying about Rebecca's complete withdrawal from the world. On November 3rd, Samuel asked Waverly if he could visit her. Waverly's instincts said no, but the boy had helped other children in ways that defied explanation. He permitted the visit, with Sister Agnes as chaperone, and the door remaining open. Samuel knelt beside Rebecca's chair and began humming. A melody Sister Agnes didn't recognize, but that felt ancient, like something that had always existed. Rebecca's vacant eyes suddenly focused on the boy with startling intensity. Samuel spoke quietly about Rebecca's baby. A daughter, he said, though such things couldn't be known yet. Healthy and strong, born with a fierce will to survive. He told Rebecca her daughter would escape the circumstances of her conception, would become something remarkable. Then he described Rebecca's mother's final hours, the exact position of the deathbed, the quality of light through the window, the specific words whispered before consumption stole her voice, details Rebecca had shared with no one. Your mother knows about the baby. She knows what was done to you. She doesn't blame you. She wants you to love your daughter the way she loved you. Rebecca began to cry, the first tears anyone had seen from her in months. Great. Wrenching sobs that gradually subsided into something approaching peace. When Samuel left, Rebecca placed both hands on her swollen belly. I'll take care of her. Sister Agnes found Crawford in his office and described what she'd witnessed. The doctor listened with growing agitation, his rational mind rejecting the implications even as he documented them in his journal. That evening, Crawford confronted Samuel in the library. He'd prepared questions designed to determine whether the boy was engaging in deliberate deception or suffering from some beneficial delusion. Samuel listened patiently, then asked his own question. Why does it matter how I know things, if the knowing helps? Crawford launched into an explanation about mechanisms and causation, about distinguishing legitimate medicine from superstition. Samuel waited until the doctor exhausted himself. You're afraid, not of me, of what it means if I'm real. Crawford opened his mouth to deny it, but couldn't. The boy was right. The world is bigger than your instruments can measure, Samuel continued. The dead don't disappear just because you can't see them. Crawford didn't write in his journal that night. Instead, he sat with a bottle of medicinal whiskey, trying to decide whether he was documenting genuine phenomenon or enabling disturbed fantasies. The decision was made for him when Samuel's presence began attracting attention beyond the orphanage walls. Thomas Ashford arrived unannounced on a gray November morning. Rebecca's uncle was a prosperous merchant, well-dressed and confident, accustomed to having his demands met. He'd come to arrange the baby's immediate adoption after birth and Rebecca's placement as domestic servant in Boston, far from Portland's scandal. Waverly was nodding along to these practical arrangements when Samuel appeared in the doorway. The boy shouldn't have been there. Children were instructed to avoid the parlor during official visits, but Samuel walked directly to Thomas Ashford. Rebecca wants to keep her baby. Ashford's face reddened. He demanded to know who this impertinent child was. Before Waverly could intervene, Samuel spoke again. "Rebecca wants to keep her daughter, and you know why she needs to keep her away from you." The temperature seemed to drop. Ashford went from red to white in an instant. He stood abruptly, knocking over the tea service, and left within minutes without another word about arrangements. 3 weeks later, Rebecca received a letter from her aunt containing a substantial bank draft for the baby's care. No explanation, no conditions, just money and silence that suggested someone had told Ashford's wife a truth she'd either known or suspected. Rebecca gave birth to a healthy daughter in December. She named her Grace. But the incident had consequences. Word spread through Portland's merchant community about a boy at Holy Hope who knew secrets people had worked hard to bury. Some were curious, others were afraid, and fear made people dangerous. Dr. Crawford received a formal letter from the Portland Medical Society requesting his presence at a special meeting regarding irregular practices at Holy Hope. 6 senior physicians attended, all older than Crawford, all regarding him with expressions ranging from concern to contempt. Dr. Josiah Wentworth, 73 and deeply suspicious of anything not found in pre-1800 textbooks, led the interrogation. Had Crawford truly documented that a child could diagnose problems through walls? Did he believe this boy communicated with the deceased? Crawford tried to explain he'd simply recorded observations without drawing conclusions. But even as he spoke, he knew he was lying to himself. He'd seen too much to maintain skepticism. The meeting ended with a warning. Cease unconventional documentation immediately or face expulsion from the medical society and potential license revocation. Crawford left shaken but strangely liberated. He had to choose between protecting his reputation and pursuing truth. He chose truth. That same week, 3 ministers visited Waverly. They'd heard disturbing reports about practices contradicting Christian doctrine, about a boy claiming to speak for the dead. Reverend Marcus Whitfield delivered the warning. If you continue permitting activities that challenge the boundaries between life and death, we'll be forced to take action to protect this community's spiritual welfare. Waverly sat in his office afterward, weighing options. He could send Samuel away, solve the immediate problem, appease the ministers and medical society. Or he could face the most profound mystery he'd encountered in 17 years of ministry. He chose the mystery. 2 days later, Timothy Ross disappeared. The 6-year-old vanished between evening prayers and bedtime. They found him 3 hours later in Portland's old cemetery, standing before his parents' grave, carrying on what appeared to be a conversation with someone invisible. When Waverly reached him, Timothy turned with disturbing serenity. "Papa says they're going to try to make Samuel leave. He says we can't let that happen, because Samuel helps people remember." Waverly brought Timothy back and sat watching the children sleep. They looked more peaceful than before Samuel's arrival. Whatever the boy was doing, it was working. The traumatized were finding peace. The broken were becoming whole. And if that was real, Waverly had a responsibility to protect him. The confrontation came the following Sunday. Reverend Whitfield's sermon focused on biblical prohibition against consulting the dead, drawing clear parallels to spiritualist corruption infiltrating Portland's institutions. He didn't name Holy Hope directly, but everyone understood. After the service, Whitfield announced a formal investigation. A committee would be formed, visits would be made, full accounting required. That afternoon, Waverly met with Crawford and Sister Agnes. 3 people irrevocably changed by encounters with Samuel, trying to determine how to protect a child whose existence challenged their world's certainties. They were discussing limited options when Samuel appeared. The boy climbed into the chair across from Waverly's desk. They're afraid, because they've forgotten. Everyone carries the dead with them, memories, grief, unfinished conversations. But most people bury those connections. I remind them of what they've tried to forget. Waverly found his voice. "What are you, Samuel?" The boy considered the question. "I'm what happens when someone refuses to let the dead be forgotten. I've been doing this for a long time. I'll keep doing it until the work is finished." "How long?" "I don't age the way you do. Silence settled over the room as implications sank in. Crawford's scientific mind wanted to reject it, but he'd seen too much. Sister Agnes nodded slowly. Waverly felt theological foundations shifting. "What happens now?" Crawford asked. "You have to decide. Send me away to protect yourselves, or help me finish what I came to do. But know this, if you help, the cost will be high. Portland isn't ready for what I carry." Waverly exchanged looks with Crawford and Sister Agnes. He saw his own determination reflected in their faces. "We'll help." Samuel smiled. A genuine child's smile. "Thank you. Because what comes next will require all of us to be braver than we've ever been." 3 days later, the Portland City Council announced an emergency investigation into Holy Hope Orphanage. The investigation would be led by a committee of civic leaders, ministers, and physicians, all people who'd already decided Samuel represented a threat. The first hearing was scheduled for Monday. Waverly, Crawford, and Sister Agnes spent the weekend preparing their defense, but they all knew facts wouldn't matter. The investigation wasn't about the orphanage's practices or children's welfare. It was about silencing truths Portland's powerful families didn't want spoken. And Samuel, sitting quietly in his room, was preparing to make sure those truths were heard, no matter the cost. The hearing room in Portland City Hall smelled of tobacco smoke and old wood. Reverend Waverly had been in this space dozens of times over the years, for civic meetings, charity appeals, discussions of orphanage funding. He'd always found it imposing but not hostile. Today, it felt like a courtroom designed for conviction rather than justice. The investigative committee sat behind a long oak table at the room's front. Reverend Marcus Whitfield, stern and confident. Dr. Josiah Wentworth, radiating professional disapproval. Mayor Harrison Blackwell, whose family had helped found Portland, and whose expression suggested this was an inconvenient distraction from more important business. And 2 other civic leaders whose names Waverly knew, but whose faces blurred together in his anxiety. Behind them, filling the gallery seats, sat perhaps 40 observers. Church members, concerned citizens, people whose interest in the orphanage's practices seemed less about child welfare and more about spectacle. Samuel sat beside Waverly, dressed in the cleanest clothes the orphanage could provide. The boy's calm was unnatural for a 10-year-old facing such scrutiny. He watched the committee with the same patient attention he brought to everything, as if he'd witnessed scenes like this many times before, and knew exactly how they would unfold. Dr. Crawford sat on Waverly's other side, his medical bag at his feet, brought as if physical evidence could defend against accusations of spiritual corruption. Sister Agnes occupied the row behind them, her weathered hands folded in prayer. Reverend Whitfield called the hearing to order with unnecessary formality. He outlined the committee's concerns, reports of unusual practices at Holy Hope, claims that a child in the orphanage's care possessed abilities that contradicted natural law and Christian doctrine, allegations that vulnerable children were being exposed to spiritualist influence. Waverly stood to respond, his prepared statement carefully worded to acknowledge Samuel's unusual perceptiveness while attributing it to natural empathy rather than supernatural means. He described improved outcomes for traumatized children, cited testimony from grateful families, emphasized the orphanage's long history of proper Christian care. The committee listened with expressions that made clear they'd already reached their conclusions. Dr. Wentworth questioned Crawford about his medical documentation. Had he truly recorded claims that defied scientific explanation? Did he stand by observations that no reputable physician would countenance? Crawford's response surprised Waverly. Instead of the defensive equivocation they'd rehearsed, the doctor spoke with quiet conviction. "I've documented what I observed. Whether my observations fit current medical understanding is irrelevant to their accuracy. Science advances by acknowledging phenomena we can't yet explain, not by denying evidence that challenges our theories." Wentworth's face reddened. "Are you seriously suggesting that this child possesses abilities beyond natural capacity?" "I'm suggesting that our understanding of natural capacity may be incomplete." The committee conferred in whispers. Mayor Blackwell leaned forward. "Perhaps we should hear from the boy himself." Samuel stood without being prompted. He walked to the front of the room with steady steps, turning to face the committee and gallery. For a moment, he simply looked at each committee member in turn, his dark eyes seeming to see through layers of civic authority to something beneath. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the room despite its childish pitch. You want to know what I am? Whether I'm dangerous, whether I should be removed from the orphanage for the protection of the other children. Reverend Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. We want to understand the nature of your abilities, how you claim to know things you couldn't possibly know. Samuel's expression was neither defiant nor submissive, simply patient. I know things because I listen, not just to words, but to what people carry with them. Memories, grief, secrets they've tried to bury. The dead speak through the living in ways most people have learned to ignore. I haven't learned to ignore them yet. Muttering rippled through the gallery. Whitfield raised his hand for silence. You claim to communicate with the deceased. That's spiritualism, which is explicitly... I don't claim anything. Samuel's interruption was gentle but firm. I simply tell people what I hear. Whether you call it spiritualism or empathy or madness doesn't change what it is. Dr. Wentworth stood, his voice sharp with professional outrage. This is precisely the kind of dangerous delusion. Samuel turned to face him directly. Your son didn't die in the shipwreck. He died 3 days later, in your home, from injuries you failed to treat because you were too proud to admit you didn't know how to save him. The room went absolutely silent. Wentworth's face had gone gray. How dare you? He wants you to know it wasn't your fault. The injuries were too severe. No doctor could have saved him. But you've spent 20 years believing you failed him, and that guilt has made you cruel to anyone who suggests medicine has limitations. Wentworth sat down heavily, his hands trembling. Someone in the gallery gasped. Waverley felt his own chest constrict, recognizing the expression on the old doctor's face. The look of a man confronting a truth he'd spent decades avoiding. Samuel turned to Mayor Blackwell. Should I continue? Or would you prefer I stop before we discuss why certain families in Portland prospered while others suffered? The mayor's composure cracked slightly. I don't know what you think This building stands on land that belonged to the Pennacook people. They were driven off through violence and legal theft. Some of their descendants are still alive, living in poverty in the settlements outside town, while the families who profited from their displacement sit on committees and make decisions about morality. Blackwell's face had gone rigid. Those are matters of historical record, not supernatural knowledge. The orphanage sits on burial ground. Samuel's voice remained calm, but something in his tone made the temperature in the room seem to drop. Not just Pennacook burials, other graves, people who died in chains, children who worked in the first mills until their bodies gave out, all buried without markers, without acknowledgement, their suffering erased from the stories Portland tells about itself. Reverend Whitfield stood abruptly. This hearing is about your practices, not the city's history. They're the same thing, Samuel said. You want to remove me because I remind people of what they've forgotten, because the children at Holy Hope feel the weight of all that unacknowledged suffering, and I help them understand why they feel it. That's my dangerous practice, making the invisible visible. The gallery erupted in voices, some outraged, some uncertain, some that sounded almost relieved, as if Samuel had spoken aloud thoughts they'd been afraid to voice. Whitfield hammered for order. When the room quieted, he addressed Samuel with barely controlled anger. These accusations are not accusations. Samuel's interruption was matter of fact, just truth. The same truth that's written in Portland's land deeds, census records, shipping manifests. The same truth your grandparents knew and your parents chose to forget. He turned to address the entire room. Every person here carries the dead with them. Parents, grandparents, people who came before and left debts unpaid. You can choose to acknowledge them or spend your lives running from what you already know. But the dead don't disappear because you stop listening. They just grow louder. In the silence that followed, Sister Agnes rose from her seat. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who'd outlived most of her critics. I've buried 3 husbands and 2 children. I've sat with the dying for 50 years, and I can tell you that what this boy does isn't evil or dangerous. He simply helps the living remember what they owe the dead: acknowledgement, truth, the courage to face history honestly. One of the gallery observers stood. A woman Waverly didn't recognize, middle-aged and plainly dressed. My grandfather worked in the mills when he was 8 years old. Lost his arm in the machinery when he was 12. The family that owned those mills built the church where Reverend Whitfield preaches every Sunday. No one ever acknowledged what happened to the children who built Portland's prosperity. Another voice, from the back. My grandmother was Pennacook. She used to tell stories about this land before the city, about the sacred places that were destroyed. We were taught to stop talking about it, to forget. More voices joined, people speaking of hidden histories, unacknowledged debts, the weight of inheriting prosperity built on suffering. The committee tried to restore order, but something had broken open that couldn't be easily contained. Waverly watched Samuel during this eruption of suppressed truth. The boy showed no triumph, no satisfaction, only a kind of weary recognition, as if he'd seen this pattern before, the moment when denial cracked and people glimpsed the cost of their collective forgetting. Mayor Blackwell finally restored enough order to speak. His voice had lost its earlier confidence. This hearing was called to address specific concerns about practices at Holy Hope Orphanage. It has deviated from that purpose. The committee will adjourn to discuss our findings. But even as he spoke, Waverly could see the mayor's certainty had fractured. The investigation had been designed to silence uncomfortable truths, but Samuel had turned it into a forum for speaking them aloud. The committee withdrew. The gallery dissolved into clusters of intense conversation. Waverly approached Samuel, unsure what to say. The boy looked up at him with those ancient eyes. They'll recommend my removal, not because they disbelieve what I said, but because they believe it too much. Truth is more dangerous than lies when people have built their lives around forgetting. You don't seem troubled by that. Samuel's expression was sad but accepting. My work here is almost finished anyway. The children at Holy Hope needed to understand why they carried such weight, why grief and trauma felt heavier than their individual circumstances could explain. Now they know. They'll teach others. The remembering will continue without me. Crawford approached, his face reflecting the same confusion Waverly felt. What happens to you now? I'll move on. There are other places where the dead need to speak. Other communities that have forgotten what they owe the past. You're just a child, Crawford protested, his medical rationality reasserting itself. You shouldn't have to carry this burden. Samuel smiled. The first genuine child's expression Waverly had seen from him. I'm not a child. I just wear this shape for a while, until the work is done. Then I become something else, somewhere else. It's been happening for longer than you'd believe. The committee returned after 30 minutes. Reverend Whitfield read their decision with visible discomfort. The committee finds that while Holy Hope Orphanage has not engaged in explicitly prohibited practices, the presence of the child known as Samuel creates an atmosphere of spiritual confusion that may be detrimental to vulnerable children in its care. We therefore recommend his transfer to another institution, better equipped to address his unique needs. The decision was careful, legally defensible, designed to remove the problem without acknowledging the truths Samuel had spoken. Waverly started to object, but Samuel placed a small hand on his arm. It's all right. This is how it always ends. The hearing concluded with instructions for Samuel's transfer within the week. As the room emptied, several people approached Waverly quietly, thanking him for allowing Samuel to speak, sharing stories they'd never told publicly about their family's hidden histories, expressing relief that someone had finally named what everyone had known but refused to acknowledge. The next 3 days passed in strange suspension. Samuel continued his normal routine at the orphanage, but the other children sensed the approaching departure. Timothy Ross spent hours sitting quietly near Samuel, as if trying to absorb as much of the boy's presence as possible. Rebecca brought her daughter Grace to meet him, whispering gratitude for the gift he'd given her. Dr. Crawford made one final entry in his journal. I began this documentation believing I could explain Samuel through scientific observation. I ended understanding that some phenomena exist beyond our current capacity to measure, yet remain no less real for that limitation. The boy, if he is a boy, has taught me that medicine must account for what we carry beyond our bodies. Memory, grief, historical trauma that lives in our cells and shapes our suffering in ways anatomy cannot explain. Whether Samuel is a single consciousness that moves between forms or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I can testify that his presence has healed wounds I didn't know how to treat, and his departure will leave a void that conventional medicine cannot fill. On Samuel's final evening at Holy Hope, Reverend Waverly found him in the orphanage's small library, sitting by the window and watching the sun set over Portland. "I'm sorry we couldn't protect you." Samuel shook his head. "You did protect me. You chose truth over comfort, faith over certainty. That's rarer than you know. What will you do? Where will you go?" "South. There's a plantation in Virginia where the dead are very loud, and the living have perfected the art of not listening. After that, I don't know. Wherever the work is needed." Waverly sat beside the boy, feeling the weight of questions he'd never have answered. "How long have you been doing this?" "Long enough to see the same patterns repeat. People forget, suffer, cry out for relief. I help them remember. They resist, then accept, then forget again after I leave. But each time, a few people hold on to the truth. Slowly, over generations, the remembering spreads. Does it ever end?" Samuel considered this. "I don't know. Maybe when the living learn to acknowledge their debts to the dead without needing someone like me to remind them. Maybe never. I stopped asking that question a long time ago." They sat in silence as darkness fell over Portland. Finally, Samuel stood. "Thank you for letting me stay. Thank you for believing what you saw, even when it frightened you. What should I tell the children? Tell them the truth. That I came to help them understand the weight they carry. That remembering is harder than forgetting but necessary for healing. That the dead are never truly gone as long as the living have the courage to acknowledge them." The next morning, Samuel was gone. His room was empty, his few possessions vanished. No indication of how or when he'd left. The orphanage staff searched thoroughly but found nothing except a single object on his neatly made bed. A small wooden carving, African in origin, depicting a figure that seemed to shift in the light. Reverend Waverly kept the carving on his desk for the remaining 12 years of his ministry. When visitors asked about it, he would tell them about Samuel. Not all of it, just enough to keep the boy's memory alive and the questions he'd raised from being forgotten entirely. The investigation's aftermath rippled through Portland in ways the committee hadn't anticipated. Several families quietly established funds for Pennacook descendants. The church where Reverend Whitfield preached commissioned a memorial acknowledging the children who died in the early mills. City records began including more honest accounting of land transactions and the displacement of indigenous peoples. Small changes, insufficient restitution for historical wrongs, but changes nonetheless. Dr. Crawford eventually published a treatise on inherited trauma, arguing that physicians must account for psychological and spiritual wounds that transcend individual experience. The medical establishment largely dismissed his work, but a few younger doctors found it compelling. His ideas would eventually contribute to emerging understandings of how trauma moves through generations. The children of Holy Hope carried what they'd learned from Samuel into their adult lives. Timothy Ross became a minister who preached about the connections between the living and the dead, about the necessity of remembering rather than forgetting. Rebecca's daughter Grace grew up to become a social reformer, fighting for the acknowledgement of historical injustices. And sometimes, in cities scattered across America, there would be reports of a child who appeared mysteriously, who knew impossible things, who helped traumatized communities confront the truths they'd tried to bury. A boy in Virginia who spoke with the voices of enslaved people, whose suffering had been erased from plantation records. A girl in Massachusetts who helped factory workers remember the children who died building industrial prosperity. A young person in California who gave voice to indigenous peoples driven from ancestral lands. Always the same pattern. Arrival without explanation, truth-telling that sparked resistance and eventual acknowledgement. Departure leaving only questions and changed hearts. Whether these were all manifestations of Samuel or separate individuals serving the same purpose, no one could say with certainty. Dr. Crawford, in his final journal entry before his death in 1889, offered his ultimate conclusion. Some questions cannot be answered through observation and logic. We must simply witness what occurs, document what we can, and trust that phenomena beyond our understanding serve purposes we may never fully grasp. Samuel, whatever he was, taught me that healing requires acknowledging what we carry from the past, that the dead speak through the living in countless ways. That truth, however uncomfortable, is ultimately more merciful than the lies we tell ourselves to avoid pain. I never saw him again after that November morning when he vanished from Holy Hope. But I've spent these 37 years watching the ripples from his brief presence spread outward, touching lives he never directly encountered, keeping alive the essential truth he embodied, that we are not separate from those who came before us, and that our healing depends on honoring their suffering rather than forgetting it. If there is a heaven, I hope to meet him there and finally learn the full truth of what he was. Until then, I carry what he taught me, and trust that the work he began will continue through those who dare to remember rather than forget. The journal ended there. Crawford died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep. His final words reportedly about a boy with ancient eyes who'd shown him that the boundaries between life and death were more permeable than science admitted. Reverend Waverly outlived him by only 2 years. On his deathbed, surrounded by former students and colleagues, he spoke of Samuel one final time. "The greatest gift," he whispered, "isn't certainty. It's the courage to embrace mystery and trust that what we cannot explain may still be true and necessary." He died with the African carving clutched in his weathered hands. The carving was buried with him at his request. But those who attended his funeral, including several middle-aged adults who'd been children at Holy Hope during Samuel's residence, swore that as the casket was lowered into the ground, they heard something. A child's voice, humming a melody that felt ancient and familiar. A tune that seemed to bridge the distance between the living and the dead. A reminder that some truths, once spoken, echo across generations, waiting for those brave enough to listen. In 1923, when Holy Hope Orphanage was finally demolished to make way for a modern hospital, workers discovered something beneath the foundation, a burial ground containing the remains of dozens of individuals, Pennacook people, enslaved Africans, children from the early industrial period, all buried without markers, without acknowledgement, their existence erased from official histories. The discovery sparked a municipal project to identify and properly memorialize those who'd been forgotten. It took 11 years and the work of countless volunteers, but eventually markers were placed, names were recorded, and Portland formally acknowledged the suffering upon which its prosperity had been built. No one involved in the project had known Samuel personally. He'd been gone for over 70 years. But several volunteers reported dreams during the work. A boy with dark eyes, watching them uncover truth and return dignity to the forgotten dead. Always the same image. Always the same sense of patient approval. Always the feeling that somewhere the work continued.